The pattern of segregated campus associations and integrated regional and national meetings continued until after the passage of the civil rights legislation in the 60s. YM and YWCA activities began to be held together. The first joint meeting in Los Angeles was held in 1928. Finally, in 1935, the National Intercollegiate Christian Council was formed to develop common programs and hold joint meetings. Credit for the success of student YW and YMCAs has been traced to support from the national boards, essential services were provided on the campuses, alumni who remained active after graduation, faculty leadership and support. No matter how successful the Y programs were, some denominations developed student ministries to serve their own evangelistic, cultural, or theological needs. The Methodist Church created activities centers adjacent to university campuses as a home away from home. The Lutheran student movement was organized in 1922 to bring together Lutherans of all backgrounds into one organization. John R. Mott, who still traveled all over the world on behalf of the World Student Christian Federation, called several meetings to discuss a united movement. No agreements were reached for several years. As World War approached, the great theologian Karl Barth reminded students to study with the Bible in one hand and the daily newspaper in the other. During World War II, U.S. students raised funds to support students in resistance movements and those who fled Nazi tyranny. Billy Rowland, formerly a student volunteer movement field worker, was an executive in the World Student Fund, which administered the funds. Building a school for refugees in France was one major achievement. The first international meeting of students after the war was held at the school. A club for Japanese students was active at the University of California, Berkeley in 1940. In 1942, all Japanese were forced to go into concentration camps. Students released from imprisonment later resumed leadership in the student movements. After World War II, refugee students were welcomed when they arrived in this country to start a new life. Meanwhile, the United Student Christian Council, which had been formed in 1944 to include the YMCA, the YWCA, and denominational student programs, expanded its activities. Because theological foundations had been shaken by World War II, students faced new questions, both of personal faith and how to discern the activity of God in the university. How can they be Christian students, not merely students who happen to be Christian? Obedience to God meant that study was the proper liturgy of the mind, the vocation of the student. Study groups called into question the nature of the university itself. Does it exist to seek and to teach the truth? Or is it a service station for the military-industrial complex? The popular image of students of the 50s was that it was the silent generation. Not all students, though, were so silent. Participating in ecumenical work camps was the summer activity for many. They helped build communities for displaced persons or helped rebuild churches. Working with students from all parts of the world and different denominations deepened their ecumenical commitment. Other students worked in areas of need in this country, providing services that otherwise were not available. Social justice issues also emerged. Members of student YWCAs in the South received training in how to integrate their campuses. The 18th Quadrennial Conference at Athens, Ohio, at Christmas time, 1959, was a forerunner of student activism of the 60s.
I don't believe that the student generation from 1958 to 65 were quiet. No, certainly not. In fact, I would say that
Bola Ige, now a lawyer in Nigeria, where he was imprisoned for several years, was conference coordinator.
Those were the years in which students believed that they had an important contribution to make to the lives of their communities and to the total life of the country.
Martin Luther King Jr. inspired students to become involved in the struggle for civil rights. Jim Lawson trained students in nonviolent protest. Some delegates returned home to sit in at lunch counters and other public facilities.
And at the Athens Quadrennial, I must say that I found students then not only active, but also intelligent, very open, and willing to become citizens of the world. And it was no surprise that shortly after, when President Kennedy came to office, I mean, they were willing to go into the world. And this was what the student volunteer movement had been preaching to students. And you had a generation of students in America who were willing to go to various parts of the world to do good.
Students who were committed to peace protested the Vietnam War. Other students joined in campus demonstrations to change conditions on their campuses. Action came first. Reflection could come later. Organizational change came as well. The University Student Christian Council and the Student Volunteer Movement merged to form the National Student Christian Federation in 1963. And then, in order to achieve a local campus student and faculty movement, the University Christian Movement replaced the NSCF in 1966. One major conference was held by UCM, the Cleveland Week of Process 67. It was the climax of a year-long partnership of students, faculty, and other adults in an alternative educational experience. The National Board of UCM voted itself out of existence in 1969, with the hope that a new movement would replace it. That movement has yet to arise. When students were killed and wounded by National Guardsmen at Kent State and the police at Jackson State, one era ended and a new one began. Ecumenical action moved to local settings where groups worked together to feed the hungry, challenge racism and sexism, and free the oppressed. To work for clean air and water, to preserve the environment for future generations, and to build homes for the homeless. Student Christian movements change as opportunities and challenges arise. The students in Tiananmen Square, like students in Europe, Korea, and elsewhere, struggled for freedom and against oppression. Nelson Mandela's freedom is celebrated because students and other freedom fighters in South Africa were supported by students and others in this country.
In the corridors of power in Western nations, it was religious communities, college and university campuses, and anti-apartheid organizations in the United States and elsewhere that stood firm on economic sanctions. I am here today to say thank you.
A cloud of witnesses ventured in faith to proclaim the good news of God in Christ, to live in the unity God gives the church, to serve human need, and to struggle for social justice. Can we do any less?